Hello, welcome to Free Will, Science, and Religion. I'm Chandler Klebs, and I'm here with George Ortega and Quayd. And today we're going to talk about why free will is impossible. Just like we used to do in our older episodes, we're going to go into some of the logical reasoning for why nobody can have a free will and how it's incoherent. And after that, we can talk about why some people believe it, some don't, why people, based on their history, may be biased for or against the belief in free will. And so I could start with a basic discussion of causality, or I could let one of you guys start if you'd prefer.
Chandler, go ahead.
All right. Okay, so anytime someone says they chose something, there's going to be some reason or a cause for why they did what they did. And I tend to use reason and cause interchangeably. Because for the most part, they're sort of the same thing. But basically, like somebody says, well, I chose to eat oatmeal this morning. Well, why did you choose to eat oatmeal? Well, I felt like it. Well, why did you feel like it? Because I was hungry. Why were you hungry? Because I have a stomach that needs to eat or I die. And so as you can see, the point is a person is not, if they're not responsible for the prior dictates of physics, biology, chemistry, or psychology that led them to eating oatmeal, or whatever it may be, like somebody might be addicted to cigarettes or whatever it is, that there's certain ideals, whether for good or bad, not even talking about whether what we do is good or bad, but pointing out there's a reason why we're doing that thing, and that reason has a reason, or that cause has a cause. And that's the basic way of understanding that it stretches back to before we were even born, before we were conceived, that we would be doing what we're doing at this very moment. But then some people, they try to come up with this quantum indeterminism thing.
Chandler, well, before we get into that, I just want to make a bit of a clarification in terms of reasons and causes, because sometimes people, this is like from a psychological perspective, sometimes people will say, well, I just decided to choose an apple over an orange for no reason at all. It was my free will. So in that case, it's like, fine, they may not have had a reason, or they may not be aware of the reason, but it still has a cause. Like a cause will always have a reason. A reason may not always have a reason will always have a cause. A cause may not always have a reason.
Okay, let me make sure I understand, George. So you're kind of saying that reason and cause have a different sort of meaning?
They do in context. For example, you just ask somebody, all right, I'm going to, pick the number 56 or 21. And they do that. And you ask them, what was the reason for choosing one over the other? And they very genuinely may not know. They say, I don't have a reason. I just, it just came out. So sometimes we do things that we're not aware of the reasons why we might, decide one thing over another. But again, the important point is, even though we're not aware of a reason, or even though we think there may not be a reason, even in our unconscious, there's always a cause. There's always this causality.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I still have a hard time understanding the difference. I mean, like for example, I suppose with the reason we think of like an actual explanation of why that somebody would say the number 26 or instead of 56, or I don't remember what the numbers were anymore.
Subjective and conscious, I think, is kind of the point. If you have a reason for something, you're at least you're claiming to have consciousness of the purpose behind something, whereas causes are there whether or not you acknowledge them or are aware of them. It's like
exactly
like the whole, the philosophical, hopefully we're past it by now, but if a tree falls in the forest, does it make a sound if no one's there to listen? We can say that it doesn't, that there's no cause behind, why something like that happens. But I mean, it's reasonable to assume that it does, and you're just not aware of what it is, just because you're removed from it.
So, yeah, like maybe a reason is more psychological. When we think of a reason, we think of a person who had a plan and they intentionally did something. Um, so, yeah, people give reasons for things, but there may be times where they may not be able to give a reason, or it may not have even been an intentional act, like they slipped on a banana peel or whatever, and that was caused by them walking in a direction and there being a banana peel they slipped on. But it wasn't a reason so much because it wasn't a planned act. It wasn't intentional. It had nothing to do with a will or anything, but it was just caused by the circumstances.
Well, yeah, Chandler, that's a third instance. In other words, sometimes we do things when even free people who believe in free will acknowledge it wasn't up to us. For example, if we sneeze or something or hiccup, we're doing these things, but I don't think even a free will person would say, "Oh yeah, I'm doing this of my free will." So,
yeah, it's interesting.
I think that's what you're saying. Like, you can still define, when we use reason and just common vernacular, sometimes we mean cause. Like, what was the reason behind that? We mean, what was the cause behind that?
exactly.
Yeah, so you can use them interchangeably, but a lot of times when we say reasons, we're talking about your reasons. What are your reasons? What's the reason you did this?
Yeah, and that's important because each person, two or more people may do the same type of thing, but they may have different reasons for why they did it, which would equate to different causes as well. But yeah, typically I do mean those terms interchangeably, sort of like George uses God and the universe interchangeably.
Yeah, and I think it's fair to say you can do that. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's like there's a physical reason why things happen. Absolutely.
Oh yeah. Yeah, and so what's interesting is that, yeah, there will be some people who try to say, well, yeah, but there's no reason why I did this thing. I just lifted my arm for no reason at all, or something like that, which is interesting because some people, that is basically how they try to define free will, is that if it's free from determinism and that it happens for no reason at all, then they say it's their free will. But then how can it be willed? It could be free from causality if you could know that causal events did happen, but it wouldn't be willed by the person because it can't happen for a reason. They can't have a reason for it. The cause cannot have originated from them, so how can they take credit or blame for it? And so the whole notion of the type of free will relevant for moral responsibility is still out the window under an acausal system.
Yeah, Chandler, so you were going into the causality of it, the quantum stuff, or?
Yeah, I was going into that a little bit because for the most part, I explain everything in terms of determinism. But then when people try to throw in true randomness or acausality into the mix because they think that provides free will, I want us to also make that clear that even if particles moved for no reason, tiny quantum particles move for no reason, that doesn't actually grant people the type of free will that people are believing that they have and that they use to blame people and punish them.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really so. Like, I had a conversation yesterday about free will with a few people because one of the people wanted to know my opinions. The other one I've been a long time friend with, and he believes in free will, but it's very limited. He basically explained my position to the other guy, and the other guy agreed with me like almost immediately. He saw like, yeah, none of that free will stuff really makes any sense. But my friend has this issue with the idea, and like what it sums up for him is, first of all, he agrees he doesn't have any good arguments. Like, so he still accepts free will, but he concedes that he doesn't have a reason for explaining why. But the part that is interesting to me is that the way that he describes it when he says it, he's like, if I bend over to pick this cup up, right? Like, there might be a bunch of reasons that's happening, a lot of causal factors that go into that thing happening. And the way that he describes it is, but at the end of the day, it's my choice. And so, like, my kind of tactic at that point, because he said it before. So like prompt him, like, what does that mean at the end of the day? Like that is such a vague term that doesn't explain. Like explain to me the mechanism of free will and how that leads to you picking up the cup or not. Like how is that involved in the process? And he can't do it. And that's where the whole thing, it's like, I started thinking of it this way, like a lot of times getting in an argument with people who believe in free will, not always, but a lot of times, it's like popping the hood of a car and seeing no engine. And like there's nothing there. Like it looks like a car, it looks like it could run, but then you pop the engine and you see it's all rhetoric. Like it's all just, it's all, there's no actual substance there. And it's the problem for me is that, you're sitting here having this conversation with people and they're like, no, it works. And you're like, there's no engine. And they go, no, but look, there's a fuel line. There's like a fuel line right here. And it's like, yeah, I understand there's a fuel, but it doesn't connect to anything. Like there's no mechanism that you can explain here. The problem is that it's self-refuting, because the second they put that mechanism there, it's determined. Like it's a catch-22. Like it's a catch-22, except we're not setting it up. The universe is setting it up. Like there's no way to intelligibly have that conversation with somebody because it's just not there.
Yeah, Quayd, another way to express that is like, let's say you're driving on a long highway in the desert and you see water, or mirage of water in the distance, right? Yeah. And like, so, you get to, let's say by the mirage, there's this big, cell phone tower or something. The water is by the cell phone tower. So you drive, you finally get there, and there's no water. But then the person sees, oh, no, I was mistaken. It's actually over there, and they still see the mirage.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's also it, yeah. That's like a pole goes, or a goalpost shifting almost. Like
in a way, yeah.
Yeah, they're trying to get you to look in a different direction. Yeah, I agree. But I do want to... there's a point of dissension here almost. Maybe it's something that we could talk about, because the thing with responsibility, right? Like, I don't want to conflate free will not existing with there being no responsibility. Me personally, there's reasons for that. I agree with the blame part. By the way, my friend, after talking to him, he accepts free will, but he agrees there's still no place for blame. There's still no place for anger. So he's got this kind of Daniel Dennett position, even though he doesn't know what Daniel Dennett argues. And so I'm like, on some level, I'm like, okay, well, that's better than the people who are clearly trying to blame people and have anger towards them. I forgot what I was saying.
Yeah, Quayd, I think we're in agreement. I mean, like Chandler and I, basically, what we do is we distinguish between fundamental responsibility, for example, and pragmatic responsibility. In other words, like if we want to assign, responsibility to something, for what happens, then we assign it to the universe. In other words, the universe, if we're going to use that. But otherwise, we quote unquote assume responsibility, because otherwise, without that, there would be no moral order,
Right, you couldn't put someone. Yeah, that's my thing. Is like to me, the root word behind responsibility is just response. So who do I respond to? And in a lot of instances, then people aren't responding correctly because their response is just to the individual, and they don't recognize that with any issue, there's not just one thing that is responsible. There's a society that's responsible. There's a city that's responsible. There's a voting base that's responsible, and we're holding one person responsible. And by responsible, I mean responding to them by, this person's dangerous. We have to pragmatically put them behind bars so they don't hurt other people. But we don't respond to the other things. So we're not holding people responsible.
That's a great point. We tend to focus on the pragmatic versus fundamental responsibility. We have to do shows on collective responsibility versus individual responsibility. That's we haven't done nearly enough about that.
Well, the word responsibility always trips me up big time, because I dislike the word, because people do conflate and confuse the issue, because people are either using the strong sense or the weak sense or the fundamental versus the pragmatic, and they use them interchangeably. They use the word responsibility for both senses, and they're a little bit different, aren't they?
Yeah, I would agree with that for sure.
Yeah, and even like if we go from individual to collective responsibility, for example, we are collectively responsible for climate change, but even then it's not our fault. It's like, but I guess the way we mean it is like, in certain, for example, with inner city crime or whatever it is, it's just so wrong to blame the individual, when the answer lies more within society. Even though you can't even blame society, that's where the answer, that's what has to be addressed.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, especially if you want to solve the issue. Like the thing with like, take global warming, for instance. So like, I completely agree. I hate the word fault. I hate the word blame. I hate the word anger. Those all need to go. Like those need to be set aside and dismissed, like almost in the full. I can't think of any real reason for them because they clearly have negative connotations. But if you want to, like, say, solve global warming, like, all I mean when I say we're responsible for this is if you want to solve this issue, you have to respond to these phenomena, basically. If you want to solve this issue, Republicans are responsible in that we need to respond to them so that they behave differently. And we start to ask the questions, how do we get them to behave differently so that way they stop voting against their well-being, basically. They're basically destroying themselves, and they're just not aware of it. So like they're responsible in that's who I have to respond to if I want to solve this issue. Or this group is who I have to respond to if I want to make a change in this area. My senators are responsible for the laws in the area because if I want to change them, I have to speak to them. They're the responder, or they're the person I have to respond to, basically.
I think we need to get into a little bit what the word responsibility means, because clearly there's a connection between the word respond and response and responsibility. And trying to get down to what the meaning of that is, I'm a little bit confused on. Because it is hard to know what someone means because if we say that humans are responsible for climate change, it's both true and false depending on which sense of the word we're using. Because sure, it's what humans are doing that is contributing to climate change, and it wouldn't happen if there were no humans. So, but it doesn't mean that they are actually choosing, that they're actually self-causing anything. And it's certainly not an individual, but a group. Like no one human, if there was only one human on the planet, they could not actually cause climate change all by themselves. So it's a collective thing, but nobody can be blamed. So perhaps we could have responsibility, but not blameworthiness.
Well, Chandler, again, like, I mean, like, even like, well, all right, nobody's to blame, but I mean, like, whether you use the word accountability or responsibility, you have to kind of like, have a word that denotes, that the answer, has to come from either the individual or society or both. So like, for several years now, we've been relying on the distinction between pragmatic and fundamental responsibility. Now, having said that, we may need to like coin a new word to use as a substitute for pragmatic responsibility. So that way, we lessen we make it more clear.
Yeah, we may need to have a new language for this because, see, here's the problem is like there are certain concepts in which are used for certain things of a word, but then that word has multiple meanings and it gets confused here. So yeah, it's sort of like how some of us, like I and Mitch, tend to think that we can drop the word choice altogether from the language, while some people disagree. But I think we face this problem in the case of responsibility as well, because for example, like if we were to use accountable, does accountable always mean the same thing as responsible, or is it a different sense?
They're pretty synonymous.
Yeah. Yeah. So like I just to kind of parse through this, I did just put in the definition to see what comes up. And so responsibility is a huge issue. So this says the state or fact of having a duty to deal with something or having control over somebody. So like that the concept of duty seems off to me. Like duty, like I can tell a Republican they have a duty. That means absolutely nothing to them. You have a duty to protect your planet and to stop global warming. That means in terms of like solving issues, that means nothing to them. And then the next one is the state or fact of being accountable or to blame for something. So those are words that we don't want to use. And so responsibility, it would take some type of redefining in some way in order to incorporate that, because there seems to, in the same way that there's a misconception about free will, that some people say that there's this definition of free. You ask people like Alfred Mealy, he thinks that people don't conflate free will with like blame or hatred, or even though I think he's completely wrong on this, it seems that you could do the same thing with responsibility. So you'd have to be careful with that word too, because it's kind of the waters are muddied with things that we clearly don't agree with.
Yeah.
Guys, I think we may need to coin a new word, that's neither accountable nor responsible, but just more directly reflects our meaning.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm not sure what that word is yet, but here's an idea I want to introduce is that, okay, well, see, people, since they're using different meanings of the same term, just like people use different definitions of free will, it's kind of a tricky thing here, because on one hand, I'm strongly resistant to ever preserving the notion of a free will, because it's so problematic in every way possible. There's no way for something to be willed by the person and yet be free to be any different than it is, because everything has to be the way it is. It can be different in the future, but there's no way that at any time in the past we could have done otherwise. And I think the whole could have done otherwise is the very libertarian free will belief that we have been challenging with this podcast all along. Is that not correct?
Oh, absolutely.
Most of it, yeah. I would say, though, that I will differ in that I would be fine with people. Like, I would never use the word free will myself, but there's reasons for that. One is because, like we talked about before, the word free next to the word will, which doesn't make a lot of sense and is kind of semantically irresponsible, or kind of like in terms of English, those two things aren't related close enough that you can justify using them next to each other, as one is a modifier of the other one, and the other one is how people view it, which is very important. So I mean, if everybody in the world believed that free will was what my friend thinks it is, or what Daniel Dennett thinks it is, I would have less of a problem with it. I would be, maybe passively, but I would be comfortable with it enough. But I don't think that's the way it is. And I think that most people don't view it that way. And that's the real kind of crux of the issue there. Why I'm just against.
This is a moral issue also. In other words, like Augustine coined the term free will. He was very, very clear about the meaning. In other words, like, if we didn't have free will, God would be unjust for making us do stuff and then punishing us for what we do. So the other part of this is like compatibilists are just being disingenuous. They're lying to themselves, they're lying to each other and to the public, when they change the meaning, because everybody's familiar with the history of the word, of the term. So we're also defending the integrity of the term, of the language, from people who want to kind of confuse it for other purposes.
Yeah, I agree, guys. And see, this is the interesting part, because it's important to understand that, yes, there may come a time in the future, somebody may be listening to this a few hundred years from now. And let's say, for example, that by that time, let's say they were all compatibilists, and they were using a definition of free will that was completely unrelated to what Augustine meant, what people are believing in most of the world now. Well, yeah, then I agree with what Quayd said. It wouldn't be as much of a problem as it is now, But we have to understand that that is what the free will debate has been about for, hasn't it been like 3,000 years? People have argued for this. And like, here's how we know what the true meaning of free will is, partly. Because now the debate has been framed as free will versus determinism. But think about it. If we were going by a compatibilist definition of free will, whereas, you're free, your will is free if you're doing what you want or whatever. If we go that compatibilist route, well then guess what? There is no conflict between determinism and free will by the definition. So why is it determinism versus free will? The point is that the reason determinism is used as like the being opposed to free will is because it tells us that we couldn't have done otherwise. We could not have, of our own free will, chosen to do otherwise. And that's the point, is that's the ability that's of relevance here.
Yeah. And then, like you were saying, George, to go off of that, and you made a really good point with the St. Augustine, because it fits perfectly. So again, you have people like Alfred Meillet or Daniel Dennett who want to kind of support the idea of free will and not get rid of it. But I mean, these people have to be like delusional in some sense, or myopic, because if you like, for instance, we know that a majority of the U.S. and of the world, they're Christians, right? And if you go up to them and you say, like, what is the most typified example of free will? What is the most typical example? Why do you believe in free will? Like, why do you think God gave us free will? The first thing that they're going to come up with is Adam. It's like probably the first thing they'll come up with. It's reasonable to assume that if you prompt their religious convictions and talk about free will, Adam's going to come up in the conversation. It's like, well, why does Adam have free will? Like, why do we want to ascribe Adam with free will? Well, because he ate the apple of his free will. And so what does that mean? That means God could send him to hell. It means that God could blame that person for the way they behaved to send them to hell. It's directly linked to the idea of blame innately. And so I agree with you, like, almost wholeheartedly. It has a very nefarious past. It's linked to people who were very clear about what they meant about free will. So, and if they want to go, if Daniel Dennett or those people want to go the route of trying to clarify what that means, fine. But I think in terms of getting people on board with this, it's going to be much more effective to just take a staunch opposition to it and just say, like, I'm opposed to this idea. We can reframe other things and have other words, but people clearly view this in a negative way, and we can't confuse what we mean here when we say this thing. We're talking about the fact that you do not have the right to blame people because they are not ultimately responsible for the behavior. You have to look elsewhere.
Exactly, Quayd. I don't think we deal with that enough also in terms of defining, because even like the free will versus determinism terminology, framing the debate with free will and determinism is inaccurate, because, like, first of all, it confuses people. Like, determinism is basically an implication of causality. Determinism is implies that because everything is causal, then we can predict everything about the future, know everything about the past, right? But that aspect, this prediction and this knowledge of everything is inconsequential. Whether we, in theory, whatever, can know that or not, it's not the predictive aspect of it, but rather the causal aspect that makes free will impossible. And then the other confusion is that, like, when we hold to the term, free will versus determinism, or the phrase, then we're kind of like giving a mistaken in for people who want to, like, say, well, no, not everything is determined, not everything is caused, not realizing that doesn't help their position either. So we might want to start reframing this question in terms of the one I like is, like, free will versus the laws of nature. again, just really like just do away with the word determinism, change the that phrase in the debate to more accurately reflect the reality.
Yeah, and I thought of just possibly, I mean, people have already started to use it, but just free will skeptic. You're just a free will, you're skeptical of the notion of free will. In some ways encapsulates, to me, in a fuller extent, what I mean. Like, I am just, not even to just say, like, no, I just completely, any way you define it, I reject it. Again, there are definitions. If Daniel Dennett wants to define it the way he does, I understand what he means. I don't think it's responsible to define it the way he does, but I understand it and even agree with it to some extent. But to say that I'm skeptical of it is fair to me. To say
but that's not even strong enough, Quayd, because like that, I think, is another compatibilist free will term, and that unfortunately many of us have adopted, because like if you look up the meaning of skeptical, is like to not be sure, not be convinced and all. It's kind of like a weak term relative to reject or rejection. We're basically rejecting free will. We're not skeptical. We know that it's like that free will is impossible. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, that's fair enough. That's a fair point.
Yeah, and I agree with George there, because I'm more of a rejectionist, because I feel like the problem with the word skeptic is that it says that you're skeptical, but that you could be convinced of something that may be true. But the free will, the notion of free will that we've been attacking, the libertarian that we could have of our own accord chosen otherwise, that can never be true. There's no possible laws of nature, no possible alternate universe where it's possible. It's insane. It's completely insane to be blamed or credited for something that you did not bring about, because it was started either by an acausal event that made you do it or prior causes that made you do it. Either way, you cannot be the first cause. So that's why I'm a total rejectionist of the idea. And then once we get people on board with that, then we can still go about how in our practical lives how this plays out, because what it really does is it means that we can no longer punish people in a revenge sense, sort of based on them deserving it, because nobody will believe that someone deserves anything anymore.
So then, could you just say? Because I agree with you guys. I know that there's problems with the word skeptic, but just like free will rejectionist, like you might want to use an acronym for that or whatever. But I reject the premise of free will, because it's also important too, because like a huge issue with this is, I agree with what George says. Like, people are using, when we say free will, even if you define it in a certain way, they're using it as an in to say that free will still exists. And this is very important, especially if we want people to start looking at the intelligentsia, or we want them to start looking at academic people. If people in academia are saying that free will exists despite the fact that they know the public views free will differently, that's irresponsible of the academics, because they know that it's going to be used in the general public to blame and to feel hate and anger, rather than just rejecting the notion and saying, I reject free will. I reject this word free will, and taking a new stance on things like responsibility or choice or whatever. So that way it is clear that that line in the sand is clearly drawn for the general public.
Yeah. And in Quayd, it's not just academics. Try to get a politician who understands this to admit it. I mean, no politician who'd want to win an election, at least in the United States, would ever admit to it.
Yeah. But academia is more free in the way that politicians are. Maybe they're not. Maybe not.
No, they are. They're a lot more free. Absolutely.
Yeah, but not to the. Yeah, so there's still some restriction, like that. Academics still get paid by people who go to college, like they're getting paid by the general public, but it's much different to be a politician who does it than an academic who does it.
And guys, this brings up another point, because, people need to be careful of the language they use, because like Quayd was mentioning earlier, the term free will has a certain meaning. It means the sort of thing like Quayd was saying, Adam and Eve ate the fruit in the garden 6,000 years ago, and that's why they and the rest of the human race deserves to burn in hell for all eternity. That's the problem, is free will has ties to that specific religion, especially in America.
Chandler, that's insane. Even that, like even accepting free will, that's just like to blame us for like what our ancestors, however many generations would do. Yeah. That's just like, that's completely unfair.
Well, yeah, and yet, George, isn't that exactly what free will believers are doing? Because what we do, George, was determined by our ancestors, and not just our parents. But that our parents act the way they did because of their parents and their parents before them and the society that each of them grew up in. So basically, anything you blame someone for, you are blaming them for what their ancestors did and going back and back into the past. So in a sense, blaming somebody for what their parents did, their ancestors did thousands of years ago, or blaming them for something they do now is identical. Because either way, they're still not any more choosing it.
Yeah. And this is really fun for me, because if you want to take that notion that we blame Adam and we blame all of humanity for what Adam did, there's also a Bible verse that says that the parents eat grapes and that the parents eat sour grapes and their children's teeth are set on edge. So it's this idea that there's a transference of blame down to the next generation. But if you ask a Christian nowadays, like go up to them, and I'm not saying abortion is right, by the way, Chandler. So this is apart from that, but just the argument, bring up rape, and say like, I think that a mother should have the right to, or consider the notion that a mother should have the right to abort a fetus if they were raped, right? And their immediate answer is, well, you can't blame the child for what the parent did. And it's like, really? You can't? You're telling me you can't blame me for what the previous like there's a clear contradiction there where they don't believe you should blame the child because the parent is a rapist, but you should blame me now because of what Adam did because he's my ancestor.
Yeah, that's a good point, Quayd.
There.
Yeah.
And so it's really fun to watch their head spin when you bring that one up.
Oh, I get what you mean, Quayd. See, I'm very familiar with that, in fact, because, see, that is how I viewed it when somebody has brought up the idea, like the whole rape exception with abortion. I view that as killing the child based on the fact that its father was a rapist.
Right.
That's how it comes across. And yet that is precisely what Christians do when they blame us for what they believe Adam and Eve did and say that makes us deserving of hell or whatever else because of what our ancestors did. So I see your point exactly, Quayd. It's the same type of illogical thinking.
Yeah, and actually, with the abortion question relative to standard Christianity, there's even a greater complication that is difficult to understand. In other words, I think according to standard doctrine, when a person gets to be, I think, 5 years old, there's an age of accountability, meaning that before that age, that you're not really held accountable for the right or wrong when you do whatever. You're going to go to heaven, right?
Yeah.
But after that age, you turn 5 and all, you could do something wrong, spend the rest of eternity in hell. So in a certain sense, the kindest thing you can do to human life is end it, again, according to Christian theology, of course, right, before the age of 5, so they're guaranteed a place in heaven. I mean, that's how confused the theology is.
I agree fully, George. In fact, Rob Bell said something in one of his books. I think it was called Love Wins. He wrote that basic same idea that, because how some Christians believe in this age of accountability that you go to heaven if you die before the age of accountability. And so in that case, killing them at any time before then would be the good thing because that guarantees them heaven. Which is interesting because I would have to say that there is a huge conflict. And see, the Christians can't even agree on whether you go to hell for your sins or for the sins of Adam and Eve. They can't even agree. The different denominations can't agree on which it is.
Or even within them, they can't agree.
Yeah, exactly. And there's something else, though, guys. Even if you killed someone before the age of accountability and they go to heaven, well, what if they sin in heaven and then are sent to hell after that?
No, my understanding is to get into heaven is supposed to be like you're in, right? Yeah. I never heard of somebody being in heaven and being kicked out. I don't know.
And yet what's interesting about it, George, is that, think about it. How in the world, like, I mean, I don't want to get too sidetracked, but this is a funny talk here. Because think about it. Like, if somebody can be punished by going to hell for doing something immoral or sinful or whatever, while they're still alive, then how does it make sense that as soon as they're in heaven that can't still happen? Like, I'm still not clear on how this whole thing works. And if you ask them is it possible to sin in heaven, I don't know what answer they're going to come up with.
Exactly. Most people would tell you that, the people in heaven don't have a free will. They can't sin. In other words, heaven is a place where there is no sin. So, like, a lot of people will tell you that, yeah. So, in other words, like, no free will. They can get it in heaven. They can't get it on earth, yeah.
It's interesting because what's funny about it is that that's just it, is that people's ability to sin or whatever, which, as you know, George, it just really means making a mistake, like the Jewish meaning of it. Like, how is that a good thing? Because some people, that's what they think free will is. Free will is the ability to do the wrong thing. And that's a terrible flaw. That's a design flaw for God to make people who can do things that he doesn't want them to do.
Oh, yeah. God, yeah. For example, like, and they tout free will as God's greatest gift, which is like the ultimate insanity, because basically, like, God could have made everybody, according to Christian theology, without free will, meaning that everybody'd have to do good, meaning that no one could ever, like, deserve hell, right? So, like, this quote unquote gift is what makes it possible for people to screw up and punish and suffer eternally. So, like, rather than being the greatest gift, free will is, like, within Christian and Judeo-Christian theology, it's the greatest curse.
It is.
Think about it.
Yeah, and actually, you guys are bringing up something else that I didn't think about up till now. But if you ask a Christian, like, so why did God give us free will? Well, because he wanted us to love him no matter what. Like, he wanted us to have the choice of love, not to just love him irreverently, just like without choice, right? And then it's like, well, is there free will in heaven? Well, then no, there's not a free will in heaven. So in heaven, we have no choice whether or not to love him. Like, we have no choice, basically, is what you're saying. Right? So you're saying that he gave us free will so that we would have a choice, but then we get to heaven and we have no choice. Like, that's a self-defeat that defeats itself almost immediately.
It's so bizarre because I don't understand that, because it makes God sound really confused. Like, does he want to be loved or not?
Yeah.
Like, because if God wants people to love him, he's just programmed them to always love him. Simple enough.
Love is just confusing. God just wants to be understood. He's just as confused as us, That's it. That's the real thing.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah,
love is confusing.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, like, if God is supposed to be all powerful, how in the world can anything but God have any power? Including human beings.
Yeah, that's right. That's sort of like what earlier, before we started recording, weren't we talking about Martin Luther and how he didn't like the idea of free will, because that meant that took power away from God, who was supposed to be in control.
Yeah, he considered it blasphemous. It's really weird, because if you ask a lot of Christians, they're really reverent of Martin Luther, but it's just like, Martin Luther would have sent you to hell. He would have thought you were going to hell for believing in free will, because you took power away from God. And we were talking earlier about the 2000 thing. Something else that I think we could talk about in the future is that free will is kind of new on the scene. Like, I've been listening to a lot about Greek historians and stuff like that. They clearly didn't have the same notions, at the very least, about free will that was developed later in Christianity. They clearly had a more kind of encapsulated and I don't know, in some ways true concept of this idea of moving parts and determinism, and the fact that you were part of this system that you didn't have real legitimate control over, and they were fine with it.
Yeah, Quayd, I think the guy's name is Freed. There's a good book on the history of the evolution of the term pre-Christianity, going back to the time of the Greeks. Because, like you realize the Greeks believed they had words for fate and destiny. They had no word for free will. Right. And so that kind of the concept evolved, and then, like, it's pretty solidified with Augustine, but before then they did have this kind of notion. There were some free will believers back then were saying, well, like atoms can swerve, not everything is causal or determinate and stuff. So they were grappling with it, and it was somewhat the same, somewhat different back then. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that the type of free will that Christians are believing in nowadays is a little bit different, a little bit more modern than the earlier Greek notions of free will versus destiny or fate and determinism even. I do think that the belief in free will and what it means has evolved over time within Christianity, and they disagree on what it means too, because they have different definitions even within Christianity. And then you've got the Calvinists, who are an interesting bunch, but they're still far away from the free will rejectionist types like us. So yeah, and guys, it's 7:02, and I'm supposed to finish doing a recording with Monique. So I hate to cut this short, but have we covered? Let's see. Did we cover everything? Because
well, let's do like a part 2 or something next time, because we should continue to refute free will. We really hadn't for a while, so we'll continue to do that, and then go into the other theme of what you were saying, like the biases, the different biases for or against free will. We can do that as a part 2.
Yeah, agreed. This will be a multi-part series. So how about I close out this one, and we'll continue this next week?
Sounds good.
All right. You've been listening to Free Will, Science, and Religion with Chandler Klebs, George Ortega, and Quayd. And we've been refuting the libertarian free will, the type that has been historical, the type coined by Augustine. And we've tried to go into the meanings of that, and also how it has certain ties to certain senses of the word responsibility. But it's a little bit complex, and there's a lot more material to cover on this. So we're going to do a part 2 and maybe even more parts depending on how it goes. So hope this has been educational. Thank you for listening, and goodbye.